Chapter 5. The Supreme Command Base. The Supreme Command Base assembly she'd long awaited took place 17 hours following that audience with the Emperor. The only facility used exclusively by the Supreme Command Base was a meeting hall, and that hall was also called the Supreme Command Base. It was there Lafier was taking her main staff officers, using a personal transporter complete with seating. The base had no artificial gravity. The whole room was spherical, with red flowered trees planted along the walls. The transporter began gradually slowing down once it entered the room. Deceleration took longer than in compartments that did have artificial gravity. One might expect Lafier and the others to lurch forward due to inertia, but they were used to microgravity since birth, so they unconsciously shifted their weight and maintained their positions. Only one of the staff officers failed to do so, and that was Jint. As he was land-born, he didn't handle microgravity all that well. He started floating away from the transporter, but by hurriedly grasping onto the handrail, he avoided any trouble. Lafier believed she should take umbrage at his sloppiness, but for some reason, she felt relieved. Thankfully, everyone here was Lafier's subordinate. Lafier elected not to upbraid him. There were 4 entrances or exits to the base. Directly across from the one Lafier's group entered through, the door was shut. The doors on the left and right were open, with the Military Command Director, Imperial Admiral Kanesh, leading her staff officers in through one of them, and the Military Administration Director, Imperial Admiral Lekef, doing so through the other. Once the 3 senior officers were assembled, the door across from Lafier opened at last. Emperor Du Sanyu entered, accompanied only by 2 Chamberlain guards. His staff officers were Kanesh and Lekef, and their respective subordinates, who were already here. Glaher Byra Rodrakater. Getting called by her new title like that made Lafier nervous. Yes. We command you to execute Kvizatek Rodrakater, Operation Thunderpeel. We're sure the command director will explain the operation to you. I knew it would be this way, thought Lafier. She felt isolated and empty inside. She was hoping she could participate in the most momentous meetings in the Empire from this day forward, but this time she was still only in the position of being told what had already been decided. In all likelihood, she wouldn't be hailed as a supreme commander, at least not until after their next victory. At least tell me Operation Thunderpeel's objective is Lokvakar. Fi Glaher, said Kanesh. We would like your highness to reconnect us with the Scare monarchy. Understood. Lafier tasted disappointment once again. Of course, contact with the Scare monarchy could be re-established by retaking Lokvakar, too, but as far as Lafier was aware, Imperial Admiral Kanesh disliked beating around the bush. If the planned invasion route went through the capital, she would have asked Lafier to help retake Lokvakar. Here is the marching path. The planar space map was projected over the entire chamber. Then the fleet's planned path began stretching from the Wesko monarchy, which had been retained as Empire territory. Couldn't they have at least let me choose the marching path? Lafier grumbled inwardly. She had a feeling that not letting her in on decisions of the strategic dimension was a mark of how little trust Central placed in her. It was hitting home how her current status was not based on her track record, but rather on her blood. Lafier had matured enough not to let her discontent spill out. She would simply prove she was worthy through her accomplishments. So she kept quiet and watched as the path continued extending. Between the Wesko and Scare monarchies lay the sphere of influence of the PSSU. As the planned path cut through the territory, little explosion effects played whenever it hit an enemy base. Then, it arrived at a certain star system, Nov Kinshas, the PSSU's primary star system. Lafier found herself looking at Kanesh's face. Yes, nodded the military command director. While you are out blazing a connecting path to Scare, we would like you to snuff out the PSSU as well. Lafier turned it over in her mind. Are you unhappy with the Union as your foe? Asked Du Sanyu. No, your majesty. Such discourteous thoughts did not occur to me. Then Countess relieved. She didn't wish to snub the enemy nation, the People's Sovereign Stellar Union. Paying respect to the enemy was the Avriel way, just as it was to honor the dead. I was reflecting on where our #1 objective lies, said Lafier. Is our top priority to secure contact with the Scare monarchy, or is it the Union's surrender? It's the Union's surrender, of course, replied Kanesh immediately. Keeping in mind the Union structure, it's thought that taking the primary star system will lead to the nation's collapse. And if we manage that, contact with Skier will be re-established in due course. Am I correct to think that, in the event Nov Kinshasa falls, but the Union doesn't collapse, that the operation will be continued regardless? As its Glaherer, she believed she was quite familiar with her fleet's force of arms. What she didn't know was the enemy's strength. No, Fee, said Kanesh. I regret to inform you that we cannot prepare enough firepower for that contingency. We would temporarily halt the advance. We want you to do your best to secure the occupied territory, but we will allow withdrawal depending on the situation. And that will be left up to our fleet command to decide, I imagine, Lafier told the Emperor. That is correct, nodded Dusanyu. We cannot afford to lose the Thunderpeel fleet. That is a relief, Your Majesty. If they'd had to wait for permission from Central during a state of emergency, it wouldn't reach them in time. If Dusanyu had said otherwise, it would inexorably lead to an insurrection against him. But while that choice would be preferable to sending her subordinates to fruitless deaths, it would be a harder choice for her than her own death. She was also relieved that the Emperor wasn't incompetent enough to be issuing outrageous commands. The avuncular Dusanyu, she knew, was a lover of unsavory quips and japes, but it seemed he drew a sharp distinction as to when and when not to exhibit that vicious sense of humor. Dusanyu cocked his head. We trust you couldn't possibly be entertaining any irreverent thoughts at the moment, Fee. No, sire. I was simply recalling a trifling matter, said Lafier, though she could feel her heartbeat rising. What of the blockade of the Wesco portal? The Wesco portal led to Lokfakar. That meant the portal and what lay beyond it were now enemy territory. If enemy fleets invaded Empire territory through it, the Thunderpeel fleet's ongoing operation would be threatened. In the worst-case scenario, it could even end up severing contact between the fleet and Central. The blockade had to be maintained at all costs up until the operation was complete. We'd like for your fleet to defend it as well, said Dusanyu. Lafier and Sabash exchanged glances. Thinking about it, it made all the sense in the world. The Empire's war potential was still meager. If the Thunderpeel fleet was sent on the offensive, then it would take all the military had just to maintain the current defense setup. It was eminently possible that the Four Nations Alliance, knowing of the invasion of the PSSU, would launch a counter-invasion from the Wesco portal. In that case, the Star forces would have to make their defenses sturdier still, but they hadn't the resources to spare. Moreover, so long as the invasion against the Union and the security of the Wesco portal remained closely related, it would be preferable to carry out both under a single command center. Yet it wasn't as though the Thunderpeel fleet had an overabundance of firepower, and while it seemed military command had deemed it possible, Lafier didn't find that alone terribly reassuring. There is something I would like to verify, if I may, said Lafier. Do we have the right of refusal? Heavens, yes, replied Dusanyu promptly. But there is something else you ought to know. We do not regard the Thunderpeel fleet and the current command center as inseparable. In other words, if Lafier vetoed, she would be dismissed and replaced. Fee, said Kanesh. We cannot allow the Empire to stagnate any further. We can be certain the enemy isn't frittering away their time. Wiping out the PSSU and re-establishing contact with Skier is the optimal course of action, as hammered out by military command. Fee, said Military Administration Director Lekef. This is also the most efficient plan in terms of the military's finances. As for the level of risk, to that I defer to my wonderful colleagues, but I can assure you the returns are worth it. This throw of the dice will truly pay dividends. And we did not devise this plan solely in the hopes of a moving reunion between parent and child, said Dusanyu. I am aware of that, sire. Lafier retracted the assessment she'd made of Dusanyu moments prior. This was not the place to be manifesting his penchant for wicked raillery. As a matter of fact, Lafier was quite displeased. It was supposed that her father and brother were somewhere beyond the PSSU, but there was no way to contact them directly, and so they couldn't figure out their state of affairs with any precision. They knew for sure the Star forces were going strong in Skier and actively fighting against the FNA. It had also been confirmed that the King of Cryb, Dubious, had taken command for at least a period of time after the dividing. But they had no inkling of their current situation. It wasn't even clear Dubious was still alive, and Duir's whereabouts were even more unclear. There was intel that Duir was made a temporary crown prince under Dubious, but it was unconfirmed. It went without saying that Leifir hoped they were alive and well, and that she anxiously awaited their reunion. Yet it felt as though the Emperor was ridiculing her for it. Our apologies, now we're being rude. Du Sanyu smiled. Was he taking back what he'd said earlier? If someone took offense at every little thing he said, they were unequal to being a retainer under Du Sanyu. No, sire. Leifir bowed her head. If that is so, then I can but follow your majesty's orders with humility. The Emperor nodded. We expect great things from you. The sooner you launch the operation, the better, but we shall grant you 60 days. Understood, sire. I will analyze our options post-haste. Leifir's mind was seized by a wave of apprehension, and it was the kind that couldn't be resolved through consulting with Fleet Command. Even so, she didn't query the Emperor right then and there about it. She would learn the answer for herself sooner rather than later. Would the command center abdicant follow her to the Thunderpeel fleet?